Hi everybody, hope everyone's all right. Okay, as part of LiLi, I did some research on the energy sector in Zambia. And as part of this, I looked at a couple of projects which were about renewable energy. I just want to get this out of the way here. That were set up by the World Bank. And I was quite struck by how these projects were very beneficial for international investors. So I started looking in more detail at renewable energy. And so I'm going to tell you what I found, particularly renewable energy in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm going to do this with a colleague at SOAS, Elisa van Weyenberg. So this is all very much work in progress, so I'd appreciate any feedback. But we are looking at, obviously, at all the sort of grey literature, but also at a database called IJ Global, which does project finance for the investment community. So we selected projects from there. We were looking at projects that have reached financial close, providing on-grid utility scale renewable energy. So we end up with a list of 25 projects. So I'm going to tell you what we found from looking at all of this. So we started off by, there we go, looking at obviously SDG 7, which is, it's about increasing access and increasing renewables. So we have 789 million people lacking electricity, and 3/4 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a big need for increasing electricity access. And the share of renewables, we've got 17% in total energy consumption, and that's expected to increase substantially to around 30% by 2024. So this shows this way that renewable energy capacity is increasing globally. But for sub-Saharan Africa, it's very much on the margins with electricity, but also infrastructure generally. So it's got the lowest rate of access in the world. The global access rate is around 87%, then we've got 45% in sub-Saharan Africa. And in rural areas in some countries, it's much, much lower than this. It's got 17% of the global population, but just 3% of electricity consumption. And most of this is in the countries of North Africa and South Africa. So very little consumption. I found these figures on average annual energy consumption per capita, and it's incredibly low. And Iceland has the highest. I'll put that for a little bit of extra information for you. So only 2% of this anticipated renewables investment is expected to reach this region. So in terms also of climate change, so its contribution to CO2 emissions is really marginal, particularly outside South Africa and the countries of North Africa. It's negligible for a lot of the countries in the region, but it's going to suffer the most from the effects. So countries are already warming faster than the world as a whole, and this is expected to continue this trend. It's got the world's fastest growing population, and so electricity demand is expected to increase. So there's this narrative about Africa leapfrogging the fossil fuel age. So the idea is that electrification is going to all be renewable, so that there won't be a need to go through this sort of fossil fuel stage. And there's this narrative of the region, so having abundant renewable energy reserves. Solar energy could generate electricity way beyond projected needs. So what do we need to achieve this? Well, policy is all about mobilizing private finance I mean, I kind of suspected this, but I was still quite astonished at just how universal this policy approach is. So infrastructure deficiencies are seen as a financing gap. I mean, I said there's always an area of policies oriented around the need to mobilize private finance. And these are just some of the sources I looked at. And even this SDG page brings it down to financial flows. Financial flows to developing countries are increasing, but only 12% goes to the least developed countries. So there's this strong orientation around a need to increase private finance. And this has been captured by a kind of blended finance agenda where we have to use public funds, donor funds, government funds, not for investing in projects, but for attracting private finance. So what does this mean in practice? Governments need to set up certain policy requirements, prerequisites. There's a strong call for a cost recovery tariff. Increasing electricity tariffs are important because then you have a credit-worthy utility, which is then better able to attract private finance. You need legislation, institutions. Projects need to be bankable. This word is widely used, bankability. And this means that the risks and the costs basically lie with governments. So we have contracts underpinned by these long-term power purchase agreements. Prices are fixed in foreign exchange in dollars or euros and for fixed amounts. So the utility commits to buy fixed amounts at a price fixed in dollars for 25, 30 years. And these are underpinned also by guarantees, usually with the government, and donors are involved as well in providing guarantees. Projects are mainly financed by debt. And a lot of this is from development finance institutions, which have donor backing. We're seeing a reduction in the price, particularly for solar projects, with increased use of auctions. Contracts are almost all with foreign-owned special purpose vehicles, these companies set up just for the purpose of participating in these projects. And also we're seeing an increased role for these infrastructure investment funds. So these are set up, they're managed by financial investment private equity firms, and they bring in donor money. Sometimes they bring in donor money, they bring in private money. So the idea is it provides a kind of mechanism by which investors in the North pension funds can invest in infrastructure development projects in all over the world. Actually, these are now kind of operating in all kinds of countries. It's a complicated system. You can't really trace what funds are going where. You have public, private, investing all over the place. So tracing funds is really difficult through these funds, but they're much more prevalent now. Obviously, this raises concerns. I've called these contradictions and inconsistencies. It just seems really striking to me, this idea that we have to have private finance because we don't have public finance, and yet we can only get the private finance if we commit to pay the public finance, and a public finance always pays in the end. So this doesn't quite add up, but it doesn't seem to prevent the policy being just widely supported globally. There's this whole narrative that people need to pay more, you need to increase tariffs to create an attractive investment, but I haven't really seen much analysis on affordability. And we talked about this in the Zambia paper, electricity is an input into other goods. So the kind of social impacts of increasing prices are not really analysed. And then there's this idea that governments are going to benefit from falling prices, but this is contradicted by this whole idea of having to have bankability. So you have to have your long-term fixed contract. And so it doesn't matter if prices don't fall, you're still tied into these high price contracts. So ultimately, I think we're looking at a deepening international inequality. Ultimately, projects lead to an outflow of funds. Governments, other than taxpayers and consumers, bear the risk of falling demand. So there's this idea that demand is just always increasing. People are going to want to have more electricity, whatever. But actually, this is problematic. We've seen in some places. So Kenya actually demand isn't increasing anything like the rate it was expected to. And obviously last year we saw with COVID demand actually falling. So this has raised a lot of concerns and issues. So this is I'm thinking about a sort of theoretical framework. So policy is dominated by the needs of global capital. And I think dependency theory with this idea of core and periphery country relations is something that we're going to look at in more detail. I think it's quite appropriate here. So this concluding then, yeah, investors in renewable energy in sub-Saharan Africa claim that they're doing massive amounts of good, a double whammy. But in reality, what we're seeing with neoliberal policymaking, structures of global capitalism, means they're making profits on the back of long-standing ecological injustice. So this is what I was thinking really does seem to be a very unjust transition. And this final point here, is there another way? Nobody really seems to be engaging with or challenging this in a way that is putting forward alternatives, which is something I'd like to think more about at some stage, come into the paper, but I haven't got very far with that so far. Okay, thank you.
This is a slightly different title to the one you've got. It's actually slightly, it represents where I'm at in terms of the research I was doing. I'm looking more specifically at the rise of SUVs in our transport system, sports utility vehicles, the big cars. And the reason I'm doing that is they're a massive problem. Not only do they make alternatives, sustainable alternatives like walking and cycling more difficult because they're more dangerous to vulnerable road users and they're bigger, so they do stuff like park on pavements and that sort of thing. But of course, they also have bigger engines and consume more fuel and create more pollution. And there has been some limited progress in terms of reducing the emissions of motor vehicles over time. And that trend stopped in about the mid to late 2010s. And actually, your average new vehicles creating more emissions than it did 5 or 6 years ago. And that's largely down to the proliferation of SUVs as the vehicle of choice. And as you can see here, this is for Britain, more than 40% of new vehicles are SUVs now. So my question is, well, my point is that we have to stop this. It's a complete disaster. And also, if we're going to have a chance of doing that, we need to understand why it's happening so that we can stop it. And that's what my broad question's about. And there isn't really any academic literature on this. But if you read stuff like car magazines and newspapers, there are some attempts at explaining what's happening. And I've grouped them like this. The first is the utility explanation. People like them because they're sturdier, they give you a higher driving position. And you could call that a consumer preferences explanation. But it doesn't tell you why these preferences have changed in the past, 10, 20 years when SUVs have really become so popular. And others about consumer manipulation. They spend a lot of money on advertising and a lot of it's quite fake. So SUVs are nowhere near as safe as people think they are. They're more likely to flip over in a crash. I guess the question of advertising is, so they could be advertising anything. Why are they concentrating on it? Why do they want people to buy SUVs, the manufacturers, and not something else? The other status symbols. So I've got an SUV, everyone's jealous of me, that sort of thing. But the obvious question is, well, there's a lot of things you could have to show off. Why are people choosing SUVs over other things? So these are all sort of partial explanations for what's happening, and I think they all have some kind of merit. But you wouldn't be surprised to hear that I think a system of provision approach is needed here. I'm not going to explain what that is because I think everyone here already knows what it is. So please do ask me about it. This is my attempt at trying to work out what the chain of provision is for SUVs. And these are the agents and the relationships between them. And you've got the manufacturers at the bottom, you've got the consumers at the top. In between, you've got advertisers, finance companies, dealerships, and you've got fuel suppliers and other things. I'm going to keep that on the side there. So I'm going to try and very quickly sort of explain what I think the system of provision is and how that can help explain why SUVization, as I call it, has happened. I'm going to start with advertising because it's the only place where there's been academic research, to my knowledge. And it actually goes back to the early 2000s because the SUVs did sort of start to become popular in the mid to late 1990s. And there was some literature around at the time about it. And the seminal one's called High and Mighty by a guy called Keith Bradshaw. And he notes that SUVs are advertised in a particular way, and it's all about the dominance that can be achieved over nature. Here's a typical advertisement about how you can conquer the great outdoors with your vehicle, and isn't that fantastic? That sort of thing. And of course, like the obvious irony about SUV consumption that he picks up on is that that most people that drive them don't go anywhere like this place. They stay in urban environments, going around polluting everyone, and never take them off road. Now for him, what you can see in that advertising and the way people are manipulated is that they're going for a particular type of consumer, and in the urban realm, he describes it as people who are insecure and vain, nervous about their marriages, and uncomfortable about parenthood. They often lack confidence in their driving skills, and above all, they are apt to be self-centered and self-absorbed, with little interest in their neighbours or communities. You might be thinking, well, I can sort of agree with that maybe. But work then by someone called Shane Gunster later on sort of took this apart a bit from a critical perspective and said that these sort of critiques of SUV consumption naturalize the consumer inappropriately, and they fail to take into account the context of the consumption as it really takes place. And that context is the neoliberal urban environment, where you've witnessed the breakdown of civil society, privatization, destruction of the welfare state, altogether a more frightening and chaotic environment to be in. And excuse me, oh yeah. And so in that context, they're an item of middle class consumption, quite similar to gated apartments, gated communities, where you cocoon from the outside world, and it's driven from fear of others, and that's what it is. So, but clearly, my question is about why it's become popular, an item of mass consumption. So we need to understand why, how it's become a working class item of consumption. And we also still haven't answered why the hell manufacturers are so interested in producing them. Something's going wrong with my slides. Okay. So the headline on production, turning to manufacturers then, is that the SUV as a vehicle has saved car manufacturers from destruction. They've had long-term profitability problems, and that's come on the basis of increased competition, increased scale of production, which is required to make cars, and therefore the increased velocity and output of motor vehicles. And in the mature markets of the US and the UK, Europe, that's led to market saturation. Everybody who possibly could want a car already has one. So it's a way, it's been a way out of that. SUVs, as people know, became life as rural military vehicles. They're very similar to trucks in their construction. And in the early 90s, the Detroit 3 manufacturers in the States, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, started creating these SUVs, which could become a sort of suburban car. And in doing so, they created a new market segment, which is one way out of a saturation problem, is to create something that looks and feels very different to what's already there. And they had a competitive advantage over the other manufacturers because they were used to making trucks. These things were cheap to build, but they could charge a lot of money for them. So there's massive profits that are created by it. So it took a lot of time for competitors to catch up with the Detroit 3 and start making their own SUVs. And the way they did it was to make them much more like the way cars are made, not trucks. Essentially what you have now, almost all SUVs are essentially made the same as cars. And a further irony on the urban SUV driver is, even if they wanted to take their car to the countryside and take on some wildlife, they wouldn't be able to do so because they're not capable of going off-road anyway. So they're big car. They're basically big cars with massive engines. But despite this increased competition and more types of SUV coming onto the market, they still have an extraordinary profit margin, which is quite difficult to understand. But I think is largely due to brand prestige and loyalty. It's difficult to just create a new car brand and charge a lot of money for it, much more so than it is to create a new cheap car brand. So that's production. Consumption, I'm going to skip this bit very quickly. It's an obvious point that the price of petrol and diesel has gone down, and that's been the result of government tax decisions, tax cuts, and geopolitical processes. You know, look at the Middle East in the past 20 years, for example, and you know why fuel has become cheaper and therefore enabled SUV consumption. Much more important in terms of the amount of money people spend on their vehicles to use them is consumer finance. So the cost of owning or renting a vehicle. And this has increased massively in the period that I'm looking at, the past 10 or 20 years. So here's some figures from the UK again, and this is the amount financed. So this is the cost of the vehicle people are not purchasing, but essentially financing when they go to the showroom. And this is average amount, so it's nearly doubled from 13,000 to somewhere like 22,000 in cost in 10 years. So people are getting much more expensive vehicles and taking out much more finance to do that. And you might think, well, they could be taking out any vehicle, but there's not a lot of data on this. But I managed to find something about this is what the percentage of each type of vehicle and who's in terms of all new vehicles purchased, where's that finance being spent on, essentially? As you can see, near the bottom, there's a lot of SUVs in that. And actually, this is American figures, so pickups are very similar to SUVs in the States. So that can be added on to. So it's the vast majority of new vehicles being financed are SUVs. Right. So they're more expensive than standard cars. And of course, the context has been stagnant wages in the past 2 decades for the working class. Consumption. So if you're going to get rid of these really high expensive vehicles, you're going to have to give people more finance to do that. And they come in different forms. In the UK, it's something called the personal contract purchase. In the US, they just give people ever longer car loans, and it's now 7-year average. But the effect is to reduce the monthly payments for the consumer. It's a product of financialization. The payments are securitized and traded on international financial markets. And the manufacturers are intermediaries in that process. This is quite a complex graph. This is one of these structures, and it's a BMW financing vehicle. And just to underline the point there that they're acting as intermediaries between international banks, financial investors, and the consumer. And the dealerships play an important role in orchestrating, bringing together the consumer, the finance, and the vehicle in the same place. Credit checks are minimal. But if you look at the credit ratings of these financial assets, the most important thing about them, what makes them attractive and what allows manufacturers to lend people more money than they would otherwise, is the threat of repossession, which is has its basis in car dependency. So if you don't pay your monthly payment, we will take your vehicle off you, and therefore X, Y, and Z will happen. You lose your job, whatever. And that means consumers will prioritize their car loan repayments over other expenditure commitments, sometimes even including their housing, food, and whatever else. So they're very attractive in that sense for lenders. But of course, there's a huge amount of risk that's created by doing this. Clearly, manufacturers can't just keep extending credit indefinitely to people who can't afford it. There's guaranteed to be widespread defaults. It might already be happening, in fact. Left to its own devices, this process will destroy the car industry. So having considered the system of provision, I'd like to think a bit again about the consumption culture of SUVs. Clearly, they're profitable commodities, and this is why manufacturers want to sell them, and it's rescued the car industry from long-term crisis. So that's meant broadening consumption of these vehicles to working class communities. And it's promising working class people something that middle class people have had for some time, which is, if not in reality, the ideal of protection from the chaos of urban environments. So it's extending that to the working class. And of course, that's been done through consumer finance. And in doing so, in making consumers take on that risk, and have that financial vulnerability, effectively manufacturers have offloaded their crisis onto working class communities through the medium of the SUV. So as I say, so what are we going to do about it? We know some more about it now. So these bailouts will be coming soon. So I think in understanding more about the system of provision, we can have some better arguments and strategies about what to do when the car manufacturers come knocking on the government's door. I think an argument which says that the SUV isn't simply bad for the environment, but is also doing the opposite of leveling up and rebuilding after the corona crisis. It's trapping people in debt relationships and increasing poverty. It's a powerful one. And, so I guess as a campaigner for active travel, sustainable transport, much is made of this so-called culture war between drivers and people who want to see cycling infrastructure, low traffic neighborhoods, and that sort of thing. And actually, I think understanding the the sort of the exploitation element of this is really important to cutting through that, because we're all in vulnerable positions because of this, and the SUV driver is too. And there is, in other words, a material basis for uniting the SUV driver and the pedestrian and cyclist in some kind of movement. So that's what I hope will happen anyway. That's it.